Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. It is May 28th. I am your host, as always, Tommy Brzee, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start with a little bit of a redo of what we had on Friday. If you watched on Friday, you probably didn't hear our guest, but we have them back on today to discuss the topics that we went over on Friday. Then we're going to get into a possible path for the ACC to kind of fix all the problems that they've been dealing with. Utah might be interested in making their way over to the ACC before they've even joined the Big 12. Then we'll get into the most important coach for every contender in the country, the big-time contenders at the very least. And then we'll finish it off with a Top 10 Tuesday and go into the teams that I think have the most pressure going into this upcoming year. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have a fun kind of interactive experience here, and that's always good for both of us. But let's jump right in, and we have our two guests here. We have Andrew Tate from the Andrew Tate Show around here, and Samantha Genzer from the Hoop and Heels podcast on the GSMC network. Welcome, both of you. Apologies for having to do this one more time, but excited to have you both back on.
Excellent. Thank you for having us. Hopefully it goes a little smoother than the last time.
That's always the hope.
Hmm.
But let's jump right in here and let's talk about the House versus NCAA case. Obviously, this is something that I've talked about a ton. I know, Tate, you've talked about this on your show. I'm sure, Samantha, you are slowly getting into this as it's starting to impact everything around college sports. But I'm curious, I guess we'll start with you, Tate. I'm curious, as you kind of looked into this and have kind of really unpack this more. I've seen a ton of people across, Twitter and different social media apps saying this is essentially the death of college sports as we know it. And I'm curious, do you have that same perspective? Or are you a little bit more tame in your takes as I am? Kind of, I think there's a path forward, and this is kind of a necessary step in that path, is kind of where I'm standing. But I'm curious where you are.
I do not see it that way. I see it the opposite. I see it as kind of like the world where the universities stopped taking advantage of a lot of players and hiding behind amateurism. There's a lot of players in the world, and that is male, female, but especially in the big sports of college football and college basketball, where universities have made a lot of money off of these players, and the players have been with having absolutely no power to do anything about it. The university have made a lot of money, and there's a lot of players that have not made money. I actually think this is a kind of like a new world order of college sports. I think it's going to show improvement in college sports and professional sports as a whole because of the fact that now players are going to be able to get paid. They're going to make money off their name, image, and likeness. And I can't count how many players that were not ready for the NFL, not ready for the NBA, but turned pro because of the fact that, hey, I don't come from money. Even a little money would be better than none. Now these players can say, you know what? I'm making money while at the University of Georgia or University of Michigan or at TCU or SMU. And I don't need to turn pro right away. I can get better. I can hone my skills in. I can work further toward becoming a better player. I can work at becoming a better student and maybe graduate instead of just jumping to the pros. So I think as a whole, the play on college football is going to improve. The players that are going into the NFL draft are going to improve. I think it helps March Madness because now players are 2, 3, 4 years into it, and you now know who these players are. So it improves them. It helps women's sports as a whole. That's kind of the way I see it. Didn't mean to go too long on that one. I apologize, but that's my
No,
take.
absolutely. I mean, I think that's something that a lot of people were wanting to see from NIL, and we got to see it a little bit with some kids deciding to come back instead of going pro. But usually, those are the kids kind of on the fence, right? Those are the kids kind of maybe third or fourth or fifth round of the NFL draft, or maybe a draft pick in the NBA draft, but maybe not. But I think more and more we'll see kids that maybe would be third round draft picks come back because they want to be a first rounder or something like that. So the way I always saw it was the second the first media deal was signed in college football, at some point these players were going to come for their money, and they absolutely should. And I think it's something that is a step that had to be taken, is the best way that I can kind of describe it. But I'm curious from your perspective, Samantha. We kind of obviously we've unpacked college football a ton on here, but this is obviously going to impact other sports probably more than it's going to impact college football, just from a player to player perspective. So I'm curious, as you've kind of gotten into this, what's your perspective on how much this will affect smaller sports, women's sports, all of the stuff in between, instead of just, worrying about college football as a lot of people do right around now?
Yeah, no, so I actually did cover how this will impact women's sports on my Friday episode. And it's really just the lot of the non-revenue sports, which are sports that just make significantly less money, could be eliminated. And most of the time, those are women's sports and the smaller sports in general. These sports could literally be removed from the college, and if they stay, they will probably see significant budget cuts, which really alarms me. I really see women's sports facing financial issues under the new revenue sharing model. Fewer scholarships could be available for female athletes, and I mean, we all know that that would limit so many opportunities for young women to pursue higher education alongside sports. I mean, a lot of the time you have people who go to college and they play a sport where they have a purpose, and sometimes people have a purpose of playing a sport so they can go to college, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Women have worked very hard for many years to get the
Mhm.
recognition they deserve in the world of sports, and the risk of cutting certain women's sports is really alarming to me. A lot of athletes start at the collegiate level where they really make their name known, and then they move to the Olympics and the professional leagues. And by just removing some sports from the collegiate level, there are less opportunities for women to enter the Olympics and the professional leagues. And it is a bit scary, but of course, I am happy to see that players are getting paid for their contributions.
Yeah, I
Now,
think
I was
that's
just
the.
gonna,
Yeah, go
oh,
go
sorry,
ahead, please.
I was just gonna comment and say, because your concern is I have the exact same concern.
Mhm.
The big one is Title IX.
Right.
I think as long as Congress and the politicians get behind supporting Title IX and making sure that, hey, if you're going to cut sports, it has to be even,
Mhm.
and protect the women's sports as well as the men's sports, then there's a safety valve there. But uh, you know, I'm just a big proponent on men and women that they get at least a piece of the share. Because some of these schools are making huge dollars. Not all of them. A lot of them are losing money. But I think if you make it fair and balanced, and but I do think players should be allowed to make some money. So,
And I think the interesting thing about this is you might have the ability to split it evenly, because NIL and collectives and things of that nature don't seem to be going away, right? It seems like those are going to stay around in these sports. So you still have the ability to have the football players be making more than the volleyball players, but you also have the ability to split these resources and the scholarships and everything evenly. And I'm curious, from your point of view, Tate, we talked about this yesterday, how this is impacting smaller schools. We always focused on the Power Five, and I'm sure that was the majority of the conversation in that room when they were deciding all this. So I'm curious, from your point of view, how do you kind of see this impacting smaller schools? I know the percentage for the smaller schools is only larger than it is for the Power Five, and it feels like a lot of energy is being put forth to protect the Power Five instead of make this kind of an equitable transfer into this new era, I suppose.
okay. This I feel like this settlement is going to kind of speed up the process of them kind of splitting off from each other. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but when I think about college football, I feel like there should be a whole different playoff system for the smaller colleges, the smaller Division I or Group of Five. Um, I would love to see that. That's what I loved about the College Football Super League, where you could have a totally different system for the Group of Five, where they have a playoff system and things like that, but also build in a system where the top Group of Five teams have a division that they can go to move up and compete and make a college football playoff as well, because then they could make money in the group of five playoff system, but teams that are doing really well has the ability to move up and play and compete for a national championship as well. I like that because I think everyone should have that opportunity. Um, I worry because a lot of the group of five teams, they don't make that same money, and they're going to be at a major disadvantage. Not only do I see the group of five teams, but some of the smaller leagues or it's kind of weird to call the Big 12 a smaller league or the ACC a smaller league. But when you're looking at the money that the Big 10 and the SEC makes, I worry about the group of five and the Big 12 and ACC becoming kind of like a minor league because of the fact that teams like Georgia and Michigan and Alabama can go and start taking players from those teams that don't make the same amount of money. There's some things that need to be done, and I worry about the smaller teams, but also some of the mid-major teams as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've talked about this a little bit. I'm definitely in favor of the group of five and smaller schools breaking off because at the end of the day, you're not really playing the same sport at this point, right? You're playing two totally different sports. You're playing with two totally different abilities with the amount of financial help that some of these other schools get. I mean, you see the gap between even the Big 12 and the ACC teams to the SEC and the Big 10. Imagine the gap between the group of five teams to the big boys. So it's a huge problem, and obviously there's tons of questions with this and not as many answers as we would like, but I think this is a step kind of getting towards at least answers on all of this. But we'll unpack that, I'm sure, more and more on all of our shows in the future. But we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the ACC. They are still battling Florida State and Clemson. It looks like North Carolina might get on the party, and Utah is a very interesting thing to add to this. So we'll unpack all of that right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the House versus NCAA settlement and the ramifications of that, but now it's time to talk about the ACC. It's been a little bit on the back burner lately, talking about the House case and everything in between, but the ACC is still battling Florida State and Clemson, and there have been a ton of different things that have happened over the last little bit around this case and around all of the future, really, for the ACC, and we'll break into all of that right now, but I'm curious from your perspective, Tate, all of this stuff is kind of building up towards it. Clemson and Florida State are likely out of the conference. I think we can all pretty much agree on that. The question now, for me at least, is one, what does North Carolina do? Because they feel like the big domino here. They feel like the one that everyone is pointing towards to kind of set this conference off into a landslide of teams leaving instead of possibly just keeping it at Florida State and Clemson. So I'm curious if you see that the same way, and if North Carolina does join this, what do you think the impact would be on the ACC?
Well, okay. First off, I've said this a few times that in my eyes and many other eyes, the heart and soul of the ACC is Duke and North Carolina. That's the heart and soul. Um, and it's a little scary. It's, I think, even more scary when you start looking about the fact that North Carolina has started to show that they're not happy with the financial relationship with the ACC. That's a major concern because the ACC, I feel like they can survive losing Clemson. They can even survive losing Florida State. But when you start looking at North Carolina, NC State, Duke, those type of schools starting to look at what are their opportunities. And I just saw a thing recently where North Carolina is starting to think and about possibly the Big Ten and how they're a great fit with the Big Ten. There was, I didn't get the whole article, but there was talk that there is talk within the Big Ten that North Carolina and Miami are better fits for the Big Ten. And you start looking at that and you start wondering what's the future of the ACC. You have Florida State, who has made no bones about it. They want out. Clemson has made it. They want out. And I think I've said this to you. I don't really know. Be careful what you wish for. Clemson and Florida State have been consistently talking about wanting out, but I have yet to hear any word from the SEC saying, hey, there's a home for you here. But I have heard Florida not wanting Florida State. I have heard, South Carolina not being keen on a Clemson coming in. That's you could hear literally have a scenario where the biggest, loudest dog on the porch could find themselves in a bad situation. Let's say that they do break up, and let's say NC State, North Carolina, Michigan, Miami, they end up in the Big Ten, and maybe you look at the SEC and they say maybe we already have Florida, we already have South Carolina, maybe we want someone else. That's something that hasn't been talked about. Be careful
Yeah,
what you wish for sometimes. Go ahead.
yeah, definitely. It's something that I always thought was interesting when I was breaking down all of this stuff and getting into the ACC. And you haven't really heard from the SEC much on this. And it felt
No.
like when you heard that Texas and Oklahoma wanted out of the Big 12, you almost immediately heard that the SEC was the likely landing spot and that they had kind of set up conversations there to where it was going to be a pretty seamless transition. And I have not heard the same thing about Clemson and Florida State, and I don't know if it's because last time they had to go through this with Texas and Texas A&M, it created some problems in that room, or if it's just, they don't feel the need to go after these big time teams. But it does feel like Clemson and Florida State are focused on getting out of the ACC, but not so much focused on where they end up after that, which is a very, very
Exactly.
interesting thing that will be really fascinating to watch unfold. But I'm curious, Samantha, that we obviously talk about college football, and no matter where these schools end up, they're going to be totally fine on the college football front because they can charter flights, they can do everything they need to do to make sure that those schedules work. But I'm curious, this affects every single program, every single team in these two schools, and I'm curious, from your perspective, how do you kind of see this impacting not only college football and college basketball and the ones that are going to be more than fine no matter where Clemson and Florida State end up, but how it's going to affect, the smaller sports, some women's sports, some sports that don't necessarily have the same ability to charter flights and to do some of the things that football can do.
Yeah, it's definitely about how, the main revenue sports like football and men's basketball overshadow smaller sports at most schools. I'm not saying all schools, but most schools. These sports, like they generate more revenue through public interest, and as a result, the focus on these high stakes financial and decisions tend to prioritize the needs and considerations of revenue sports. So smaller sports are just not really giving much of a voice in this. Also, there's like generally less media coverage and public interest in smaller sports, which unfortunately translates into less influence and representation in critical decisions like this. And I find this a huge issue because the sports that are often in trouble because of this are women's sports. And by not allowing smaller sports and women's sports the voice they deserve, it does fall into issues with Title IX and also just not a full representation of how everyone thinks because you are excluding a huge portion of athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. I
And
think, yeah, go ahead, please.
I was going to ask Samantha a question. Would you be pro having a scenario where, let's say, college football and let's say in college basketball completely breaks away from the NCAA, and the NCAA just covers just the Olympic sports? How do you
Just,
feel? Do you think that would be a good thing or a bad thing?
wait, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Just the Olympic sports, you said?
Well, when you think about having, let's say, college basketball break off, college football break off into its own financial entity where they're just about making money, but then the new NCAA falls under all the other sports where Title IX and everything is still in play. Are you pro that, or do you think that would be bad because the major money comes from college football?
That's such a difficult question because I mean, obviously, like a school would want to make the most profit, and by just excluding that, it would not go well. But at the same time, I think there would be, I guess, more representation of the smaller sports if you kind of split it off. But that is a difficult situation, I'll say.
Interesting. All right.
And that's kind of how I see it. It's where I think in a perfect world, I do believe college football, college basketball will be their own thing, and there would still be funding for every other sport under the sun, right? There would still be that ability to cover all those sports, but the reality is football pays for a lot of other sports at most of these universities. So unless there's a ton of shuffling for the pocketbooks and all of the and funders and donors and all of those people come really aggressively for all of these other sports and try to prop them up as much as possible, I think you could run into a lot of financial issues with that. But I'm curious, we're running low a little bit on time here with my lame Zoom, but I'm curious. I'm going to talk about it next segment, but I'm curious. Tate, you've talked about this a little bit, and you sent me the article yesterday. Utah thinking about possibly joining the ACC. I don't fully understand why they would want to, but I'm curious, just from your perspective. You do? Okay, there you go.
Okay.
Give me
here's the reason why. First off, Utah, when the whole Pac-12 was collapsing, Utah was one of the very last ones that they weren't leading the charge to leave the Pac-12. The reason why, because the Pac-12 fit the Utah, the way Utah is organized because of academics. The Big Ten fits Utah because of academics and sports. Being an NAIA school, research dollars. They make a lot of money through research dollars. They're losing money because the Pac-12, the Big 12 is not a research dominant organization. So it used to be the big two were always the Big Ten and the Pac-12, and they made massive dollars. The next tier under that is the ACC. Okay, when you started looking at this, they went to the Big 12 out of necessity because Colorado and Arizona State, and all those guys who they had been doing a lot of research and things with worked. But when you start looking at some of the schools that are in the Big 12, it just doesn't mesh well with the whole research side of things. And so they came to the Big 12 out of necessity and kind of reluctantly. And they're looking at the overall picture and they're looking at the research programs and how that's going. And they're realizing that it's not a good fit. And it's either the Big Ten is a perfect fit or the next best fit is the ACC. And when you look at what's going on in the ACC with schools planning on possibly leaving, Florida State leaves, where does that put Utah? Utah would be a great fit in there because research dollars wise, they generate a lot of money. They're a premier program. They're gonna be if they're in the ACC, they're gonna be a top program, just like they're going to be a top program in the Big 12. But the research dollars is where the real money is at. And that's the reason why they're very reluctant.
And it shows you kind of where my mind was at because I was thinking purely from a sports lens and not from all the other stuff that goes on in the university. But yeah, no, it's definitely a really interesting thing, and I'm curious. Obviously, you go to the ACC because the next best thing from the Big Ten, but 5 years down the road, there could be a world where they say, "Why don't we just go try to get into the Big Ten?" So I'm curious.
Oh,
Um, is this the last
absolutely.
Utah move, or are they just going to bounce around until they find themselves in the prize that is the Big Ten?
Utah would jump at any opportunity they can to get into the Big Ten. Um, People haven't done the research, don't realize. Everyone talks about the television dollars, and they look at and they say, "Oh, the Big Ten makes a little bit more than the SEC." No, they don't. When you start mixing the research money, that's the real dollars. That is
Yeah,
the reason why the football games, there's a lot of money being, people come to the games, they use that for a lot of their donors and their research program. But the money is in the research. You look at Stanford. Stanford's $1 billion organization on the research side of things. If you look at the research, no one talks about the Ivy League. Ivy League has no interest in joining any of these conferences because they're making their money in the research world.
yeah, it's definitely an interesting kind of an added thing into this where obviously we like to look at how this will affect the sports at those schools and how all of this stuff will be impacted on that level, but obviously that's not the end all be all in all of these discussions. You want to fit somewhere where the academics make sense, where everything kind of fits with what you want to be. So it'll be fascinating to see what Utah does. We're going to break that down actually in the next segment here, but that'll do it for our guests. Thank you guys so much for joining me again. I apologize again for Friday. Definitely a mistake on my part, but glad we got to get this in and get everyone on here for at least a segment or two.
As long as we have sound, I'm happy.
Oh, yeah, we're all good there. No worries. But we'll take our break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Utah and maybe them getting out of the Big 12 and how that will look in the ACC possibly. So stick with us, and we'll be right back with that. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the ACC and Florida State and Clemson, as well as the House versus NCAA case with our two guests, Andrew Tate and Samantha Genzer. Thank you so much to those two coming on. Hopefully the audio worked better this time around instead of what it was on Friday, which was downright annoying. I'll be totally honest with you. But let's jump into Utah and let's talk about them possibly looking to leave the Big 12. And I think that is a big confusing headline to see. I'm sure a lot of you were looking at that and thinking they're not even in the Big 12 yet, and that's the exact same reaction that I had. Dick Weiss believes Utah could be moving on, finding their way into the ACC at some point here pretty shortly, and that would be quite the mix-up to the world that we've kind of created here. Obviously, I think all of us have gotten pretty comfortable with the way that conference realignment and all of this stuff works. I think all of us know not to let your guard down and think that we're safe for any moment, but this is something that I did not expect. Frankly, I'll be totally honest with you. And from a pure, sporting perspective, I don't much understand it. Now, Tate just brought up a fantastic point with the research dollars and Utah wanting to be a little bit better in that kind of realm, so the ACC would be a better fit there. But if we're talking purely from a football perspective, which is what I'll do for the next little bit here, it doesn't make much sense to me. When you're looking at this football team going into the Big 12 as of this second, the sky is the limit, essentially, for this team. They can do any number of things and can do remarkable things in the Big 12. I think everyone, including myself, is pointing to them to be the team to beat in this upcoming year, and I would keep it that way for quite some time. As long as Kyle Whittingham is in the building, I don't think there's any worry about Utah being a good football program. So I think it's going to be really fascinating to watch. Obviously, from a financial perspective, when you look at the TV dollars and all of that type of thing for the sports in particular, it also doesn't necessarily make sense. It feels like the Big 12 is starting to kind of move above the ACC in terms of when you look at the breakdown of the college football playoff distribution is the best way to put it. I think you saw the ACC a little bit above the Big 12, right? And I think that made sense. You had Clemson, you had Florida State, you had UNC, all of these teams. But now all of those teams might be trying to find their way out. And obviously that number will drop because of that. And I think it's going to be fascinating to watch how that impacts the ACC in these new discussions and how much money they're bringing in on a regular basis, but also how it impacts kind of the Big 12, because the Big 12, from where I was standing, was the conference that I would buy stock in the most, and it's because of Brett Yormark, their commissioner. This guy came from TV. He fully understands what it's like to be in those discussions and fully understands what it's like to negotiate, and I don't think anyone in any of the power conferences and any of the schools want to go to battle with Brett Yormark right about now. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch this. I think Utah is a team that a lot of us are watching very closely, right? A lot of us are putting a lot of energy into whether they're in the Big 12 or the ACC in the coming years. I think they're going to be a team to be reckoned with. I don't necessarily think it opens more doors for them to be a better team if they go into the ACC. I think maybe if Florida State and Clemson find their way out, they still have that ability. But if they come in, maybe North Carolina stays, and then you have to battle with North Carolina, Virginia Tech, Miami, some of the other teams that are in there. So it'll be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think there's a number of scenarios where Utah decides to stay put and thinks that the Big 12 is the best fit for them, at least in the sporting world. And then there's a ton of realities where they move over to the ACC. I frankly think that's probably what's going to happen if there's so much money in research dollars and all of the stuff that is currently being thrown out the window, essentially, is currently not being utilized to the degree that it should be in the Big 12. They're going to make their way over to the ACC. We just talked about it in the last segment. That's where a lot of this money comes from, especially for some schools that might not have the best athletic departments, and not saying Utah necessarily falls into that group, but they don't necessarily fall into the Ohio State, Georgia, Alabamas of the world either. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think when you look at the ACC right now, it looks like a sinking ship, at least from the outside in, right? You look at Florida State, you look at Clemson, North Carolina, and Miami kind of eyeing that door as well. You get more and more worried about the future of this conference, about the future of the sport without the ACC a part of it. But you bring in Utah and it subsides at least a little bit of that. Obviously, losing Clemson and Florida State is not the easiest thing to replace. And especially if you lose North Carolina and maybe Duke, NC State, all of those teams, then you have a real problem on your hands, because one of the caveats of all this, one of the overarching things around the ACC right now is do not fall below 15 teams. They're at 17 right now, but say Florida State and Clemson find their way out, then they're right on that line. And then it just takes North Carolina, getting out in the forefront for that to become a big time problem. And if they fall below 15 teams, the issue becomes even larger, because the ESPN media deal would be void at that point. The ESPN media deal has said if they are at 15 teams or more, we are in. If they drop below 15 teams, we're out, essentially, is the gist of what they said. And it's a huge deal, right? You look at the ACC right now, the only thing that's really propping them up is ESPN. And it's the reason, really, Utah wants to get involved as much as they do, at least from a, TV deal, sports side, because they have a really good relationship with ESPN. They did in the Pac-12, and they will. They won't necessarily in the Big 12 quite as much. They deal with more Fox in the Big 12 and a little bit of ESPN here and there, but not nearly as much as the ACC, who has pretty much an exclusive deal with ESPN, and definitely will have a much more of a presence on those channels. Excuse me, I lost my words there. But yeah, I think Utah getting into the ACC is definitely something that they want because of the tie to ESPN. They want because of the research dollars. They want for a number of different reasons. I think the question is, the biggest question really here is, what does the Big 12 look like after this? Because the Big 12 currently is sitting at, I think, 18 teams. I could be wrong about that. I'm 16 teams, because they lost 2, they added 4. But currently at 16 teams, let's say Utah finds its way out. Then you're going shopping again if you're Brett Yormark. And I think the question becomes, Utah found their way over to the ACC. Does Brett Yormark try to poach some of the ACC teams? Because that's honestly the way that I thought this was going to go. I thought that ACC teams were going to start to kind of look at the door even more, and then the Big 12 was going to be a great recipient for a number of those teams. But it seems like it might be going the other way, at least for the time being. That doesn't mean that Brett Yormark can't get on the phone and possibly subside that a little bit by using his remarkable ability to negotiate. To negotiate and know all of the things that are happening in this sport, especially on the TV side of things. So I think it's something that we'll definitely have to continue to unpack on this show. I think it's something that when you look at the ACC right now, it is at very best a very teetering ship and a very confusing thing to watch. If you add Utah, at least you get a little bit more stable. At least you have a little bit of a backup plan when you lose Clemson and Florida State, because I think we can all agree they're out the door. They've been out the door pretty much from the second that they started all of these talks, all of these lawsuits, everything that started happening. They were going to find a way out. And Florida State has amended their argument probably 10 different times to make sure that they find their way out. So I think that's a done deal. I think we all understand that. If we talk about North Carolina, that's the big domino, as we just talked about in the last segment. But you bring in Utah, maybe you don't lose North Carolina. Maybe you don't lose Miami. Maybe you don't lose Duke. And as Andrew Tate just said, Duke and North Carolina are the heart of the ACC. When you think about the ACC, you think about that rivalry. Although there are plenty of fantastic rivalries in that conference, none come close to what UNC and Duke is in basketball. I think you could make the argument, I probably would make the argument, that it's the best rivalry in all of college sports. So it is something that is going to be fascinating to watch. If you can bring in Utah, or at least give your guys the idea that Utah is coming in from Jim Phillips' perspective, the ACC commissioner, if you can sell that to all of your schools, maybe they don't leave, and maybe you get to hang out and have a little bit bigger of a West footprint and have all of those research dollars and have all the schools in there that kind of fit the same mold, right? All of them would be kind of research-based, really great academic schools, and Utah would fit in perfectly. And then, the questions of would Utah or would some of these other schools want to move on to the Big 10 or SEC in the future, that's something you can deal with down the road. But as of right now, I mean, you're dealing with Clemson and Florida State out front. And if they leave, you're down to 15 teams. If you can add Utah, maybe before that happens or shortly thereafter, you're back up to 16. At least you have a little bit of a buffer and you can work from there. So this is something that, frankly, I didn't think was going to happen. I thought the ACC was just going to slowly kind of sink into the ocean, if I'm being totally honest with you, and slowly lose teams until, North Carolina and Duke joined in, and then it was going to be kind of a free-for-all, kind of like the Pac-12 was a year ago. A big reason that Utah is in the Big 12, because I think if you went back and all of this Pac-12 talk started a couple of years ago, instead of, all happening in what felt like, 12 months, 9 months, it felt like everyone had to find their way out of that conference. I think Utah would have looked more at the ACC, or would have looked very aggressively at the Big Ten. I think that's probably where they wanted to be. But when you're battling Oregon, USC, UCLA, and Washington, it's going to be a tough time to get that to go. Now, could they do that down the road? Absolutely. But it's definitely one of those interesting things where you wake up one day and the ACC is essentially dead and looks like it's going to be heading for a really, really tough time. And then a big time program like Utah kind of comes out of the clouds and possibly saves them. And obviously the ACC might be saving them as well, with some of the different implications of being in the Big 12. But it's fascinating. It's one of those things that I never really thought was going to be the case. It's something that I thought Utah was just going to hang out in the Big 12 and really kind of tear apart that conference for the next little bit, at least in football, and keep it moving and maybe move up to the Big 10 at some point. But I thought we were at at least somewhat of a resting point with some of this stuff. But before even the new conferences have taken shape, we have someone possibly moving on from their conference. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think all of this stuff has always caught us off guard. I don't think there's any conference realignment that would feel normal at this point, but Utah especially going from a one conference to another, and then before they even get into that one, finding their way over to the ACC would be quite the story. But we'll definitely keep our eye on that. We'll definitely make sure you guys are fully up to date on that. But we're going to take our third break here, and after we come back, we're going to talk about the most important coaches for all of the contenders. We're going to go through Georgia, Texas, Bama, Ohio State, and Oregon today. We'll continue this probably throughout the week, just getting every contender out there. But these are the 5 that I'm really circling for this upcoming year. So I wanted to break that down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Utah and the possibility that they leave the Big 12 before they even get in the Big 12 and find their way over to the ACC. That's obviously something we will continue to unpack as more information comes out on that. But let's talk about the most important coaches for all of the title contenders. Obviously, the head coach is massively important to these programs' success, but I wanted to get into some play callers, possibly some even position coaches that I think are going to hold a huge key to what these teams can do in this upcoming year. And let's go ahead and jump right in, and let's start with Charvarius Robinson at Georgia. He is someone that I'm watching incredibly closely because he is one of the most fascinating people in the business to me. I think he's going to be an absolutely massive riser in the next couple of years around college football, and he found himself in a really good spot to do that, right? A lot of remarkable coaches have come out of Georgia, Dan Lanning, the most recent, finding his way up to Oregon, and I see a very, very similar future for Charvarius Robinson. I think I would be very surprised if in 5 years he was not a head coach, to be totally honest with you. This guy has everything going for him you could possibly want, is an incredible recruiter, creates relationships like no other, and I think he's going to be awesome. That's why, honestly, when he left after Saban's retirement, some people were not so happy around Tuscaloosa when Kalen DeBoer came into town. He offered him the DC job, but he decided to stay at UGA, decided to roll with that decision, and I think it's a good one. I think when you look at this defensive staff at UGA, being able to learn from Kirby Smart, from Will Muschamp, even from Glenn Schumann, who's been doing this for a couple of years now, is a huge benefit to this guy's future, but also it's a huge benefit to Georgia. When you look at this team, there are definitely some questions on the defensive side of the ball. Not necessarily huge questions as you have with some other teams around the country, but when you look at the interior defensive line, it's not necessarily a Georgia interior defensive line as we've kind of seen in the past, at least. But also, when you look at the back end, it's not nearly as strong as it used to be, and that's where Travarius Robinson really, really does his work. He did an incredible job at Bama for a number of years working with the DBs, and I think when he comes over here, he's just going to have incredible ability to create the best situation, because there's a ton of younger players that are going to have to make plays for UGA this upcoming season. When you talk about excuse me, I apologize. When you talk about Daniel Harris on the outside, when you talk about Ellis Robinson on the outside, KJ Bolden, Janelle Aguero, all of these guys are a little bit younger, a little bit lower on the experience meter as you would have liked at Georgia. But when you have someone like Travarius Robinson in that building, it makes things a lot easier. Now, I could have gone Trey Scott, the defensive line coach, as well. He's going to be hugely important to what they do. And if Kirby Smart got that hire right, if they got Travarius Robinson right in particular, they're going to be on a 2022 level. If they can guard and possibly be opportunistic on defense, create some picks, create some problems, which with Malachi Starks back there, you're going to create some problems for defenses, or for offenses, excuse me. I think they're going to be an elite defense, and I think this guy is going to have as much to say about that as really anyone in the building. So fascinated to watch him. I think he's going to be incredible these next couple of years, and will be hugely important for Georgia being who they need to be this upcoming year. But let's move over to Texas, and let's talk about Pete Kwiatkowski, because this is a guy that I think a lot of Texas fans are, I don't want to say conflicted about, because he's been fantastic. The defense has improved every single season he's been there. But also last year, there have been a couple of times where it didn't quite go the way you wanted it to, right? The end of that Oklahoma game is probably the biggest example of where it just felt like the style of play, or the way they were approaching that last drive, was not necessarily the best way to do it. And you're playing off coverage, and you're doing some things that lend itself to a guy like Dylan Gabriel tearing you up and going for a game-winning drive. So I think there is worry there. I think there is a couple of questions. Now, they have dudes all over the field. They have very few holes when you talk about this defense. They did a great job of filling some of the holes that they possibly could have had on interior defensive line and corner with some transfers they brought in. But Ian Boyd over at Inside Texas, who is one of the smartest football minds that I have come across, is someone that definitely breaks down the game in a really, really remarkable way. But he was talking about the biggest question mark for Texas, and he didn't single out a position group. He didn't say it was someone in particular or some position in particular. He just said the marrying of these three position groups on the defense is going to be a huge, huge thing, right? You're going to have not only the D-line play well, not only the linebackers not play well, not only the back end play well. All of them have to play well, and all of them have to play together. The SEC, as we all know, everyone has players. Everyone has dudes pretty much across their entire lineup, across their entire defense. They have guys that can play really high-level football. If you can't get 11 guys that play with essentially one brain and essentially are on the same page at all times, and it fits together like perfect puzzle pieces, you're going to have problems. The SEC is a totally different game than the Big 12, where you can't just make a couple of plays a game and hope that you're going to win a game. You have to be dominant. You have to be a force at every single level of that defense. So Pete Kwiatkowski is the guy that is definitely going to make all of this work. I'm not worried about the offense, frankly, because when you have a third-year quarterback coming back, when you have all the weapons they have on offense, you're rarely going to be worried about offense up in Austin. But Pete Kwiatkowski is definitely up for a very, very big year, and if he can put it together and get a top 15, 20 defense in the country, Texas can do everything that they want to do, win a title, do all the stuff that has been eluding them for quite some time. But that's going to be the guy that really, really holds that in his hands, kind of. But let's move over to Alabama, and let's talk about Maurice Lindquist. This is a very fascinating guy. Came over from Buffalo. He was the head coach at Buffalo and didn't necessarily have the greatest record there, but did some really good things while he was there, and definitely is someone that works incredibly well with DBs. He's someone that I think is going to be fascinating to watch. Now, this one was a little bit hard because there's so many new people in the building, because there's so many different moving parts. A lot of people are important for Alabama this upcoming year, but when you look at one position that you're worried the most about, I think, for Bama fans and everyone around the country when you talk about Bama, it's the back end, right? You're going to have some young players step up into big-time roles. Jalen Mbakwe, Xavier Brown, both those guys are likely going to have to play big-time snaps, and they're not going to be able to, slack off on those snaps by any means. If they mess up, then the team could be hurt in a lot of different ways. I made a prediction earlier in the season, or really an overreaction from spring, saying this back end could cost them a couple of games. Well, Maurice Lindquist would be the person to kind of offset that, right? So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch. He's done an incredible job with a number of DBs in the past. Devin Brown, we've talked about a couple of times on here, was at Buffalo a year ago before moving over to Syracuse. He left pretty much because Maurice Lindquist left, and I don't know if he got any offers from Bama. He's a little bit he might be a little bit below what Bama was looking for, but the reality is a very, very talented Devin Grant, not Devin Brown. But Devin Grant is a very fantastic player, and Maurice Lindquist is a huge reason for that. So really, the way I look at the Bama defense, they're not going to suffer if the pass defense is good. If the pass defense is good, they'll be one of the best in the country. They'll have the ability to do everything they want to do this season. If it's bad, then the defense could be really bad, and there could be a ton of issues that, especially when you're playing Georgia and you're playing Ole Miss and LSU and all of these teams that can throw the ball all over the field, you're going to have some problems. So I think that Wisconsin game is going to be fascinating because you have a passing offense, you have some aggression going at your corners a little bit, so we'll see how they kind of react to that. But let's move over to Ohio State and let's talk about Chip Kelly, because he is, in my opinion, the most important coach that is not a head coach this upcoming year. I think he holds the key to whatever Ohio State's going to be. If he can unlock this offense the way that they absolutely can be with all of the talent they have all over the field, they're going to win the national title. I'll say that with my chest. I feel very, very confident in that. I think he's someone that totally changed the complexion of this team. Now, obviously, there's still questions of how well does it all work? Is Will Howard the quarterback that you need him to be? Now, I tend to believe he's going to be, but Chip Kelly is going to be the one that really, really makes the big leap there. Obviously, Ryan Day giving up play calling duties there is, I think, a big time step. Most schools do not necessarily win a championship with their head coach calling plays. Now, there are a couple of people that I think have the ability to do that, but it felt like Ryan Day was letting a lot of other stuff get on top of him and focusing a little bit too much maybe on some of the different intricacies of play calling, and obviously it's hard to focus on all of that when you have a million different things going around. So I love this hire. I love the personnel that they have to go with this hire. I think they're going to use a lot of two running back sets with Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson and just absolutely tear teams to pieces. But if Chip Kelly can't get that offense going, then you have a couple more questions for sure about this Ohio State team. And then finally, we got Tony Tuiti. I think this is a guy that probably doesn't get the love that he deserves, frankly. He has a very, very good defensive line in front of him. He's definitely someone that is going to play a huge part in that. And Oregon did a great job of addressing kind of the worry in that interior defensive line. Adding Jamari Caldwell, adding Derek Harmon is huge. It's one of the best duos in the entire country. Definitely going to be fascinating to watch them. And also, but the reality is, when you look at the Big Ten today, you can't just have those two guys, right? You can't just have the top line be really good and then not be able to rotate guys in, because if you're playing interior defensive line, you're going to need guys to rotate in. That's just the reality of the position, and you have to be able to go 2 or 3 deep at that position to compete at the Big Ten and the national level the way that Oregon wants to. So this guy is going to be hugely important, not only for the development of Jamari Caldwell and Derek Harmon, but also the second string guys, the third string guys, the guys that really are going to make you a championship team. Obviously, everyone has top line guys that can play, especially when you're competing for a national title. The ones that really win it are the ones that can go 2, 3, maybe even 4 deep and still be a team to be reckoned with. And that's what Oregon's trying to kind of break the door down of. And I think this is a guy that absolutely will have the most to kind of say about that. Obviously, we saw how this can kind of transform a college football season. We saw Bo Davis do it a year ago at Texas. If they don't have Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy, that's a very different team a year ago. And if Oregon can get 75% of what Texas got a year ago from those two guys, they're going to be a force to be reckoned with. And I think it's going to be fascinating to watch this team kind of just unfold before our eyes. But it'll be fascinating to watch all of this. I think it's something that when you look at all of these coaches, obviously, the play callers are going to have the biggest effect on a team, but I kind of wanted to get a couple of position coaches in there. Wanted to make sure that we highlighted some of the guys that are going to be super important for this team. We'll do that for players as well down the road, because there are a couple of players that are not necessarily getting the love on these teams that they probably should. But we're going to take our final break here, and then we're going to do a little bit of a speed run through the top 10 Tuesday of the teams under the most pressure heading into 2024. We have tons of teams that have a lot riding on 2024, tons of teams that have pushed their chips to the center of the table, and we'll definitely be able to unpack what all those teams have this upcoming year and what the pressure looks like for those teams. So definitely stick with us, and we'll be right back with that. Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the most important coaches for every team that is the big team this upcoming year. I have Ohio State, Georgia, Oregon, Alabama, and Texas, so kind of the big boys, at least going into this year. But now let's get to a top 10 Tuesday, and let's talk about the teams under the most pressure for this upcoming year. There will be some overlap here, obviously, with some teams that have the most expectations going into this year, but let's start to break this down. And definitely it's going to be something that we're going to be watching over the next couple of weeks, over the next really the rest of the offseason, see how these teams kind of build up to their 2024. But I think there's going to be a ton of questions. There's going to be a ton of worry about some of these teams, but I have a couple of teams that didn't quite make the list that I want to start with first. I think USC is under a ton of pressure. That defense just has to come along. It has to be better than it was a year ago. I think Michigan with that natty follow-up, I think that's going to be a huge conversation now. I think most Michigan fans are expecting a little bit of a step back from a year ago, but still, you want to be in that national conversation. I had Alabama. Was it just Saban? Is it just Saban, or is Alabama all the same with Kalen DeBoer over in charge over there? So it's going to be fascinating to watch that. And then I had Utah. Are they going to take the throne in the Big 12? Are they going to become the team to beat in the Big 12? But let's jump into the top 10. And I'm starting with Colorado. I understand that Colorado doesn't necessarily have the national title aspirations that some of these other teams do, but Dion wouldn't tell you that. Dion has promised that they are getting into the playoff. He has made that very clear, and Colorado has been abundantly obvious about the fact that they think they should be in the playoff, that they will win the Big 12, that they will do remarkable things this year. So with that comes pressure, and along with that also, when you are coached by Deion Sanders and when you have some of the headlines that Colorado has had over the last couple of years, you're going to have people rooting against you. So miss the mark a little bit, go 7-5, 6-6. There will be people that will be definitely kind of dancing on your graves is probably the best way to put it. But let's move on to number 9 here. And I have Florida State. I think when you're coming off a year like they had a year ago, you're obviously going to want to follow up. You're obviously going to want to do the things that you did a year ago, but assert them a little bit more, show that you're here to stay and kind of hang around for a while. But there's tons of question marks around this team. There is a big-time transfer portal class that came in, now a very talented transfer portal class nonetheless, but you're still kind of riding a line there. You're still kind of playing with a little bit of fire when you bring in so many different players and you try to essentially just make it all fit. And I think Mike Norvell can absolutely do that. He's done that in the past and has done an incredible job, but I do think there's going to be a ton of pressure on this team to not be the team that it was just a blip last year. It was just a mirage that they were able to pull off a 13-0 season. If they take a step back, that's what people will be saying. There's no two ways about that. So it'll be fascinating to watch this team unfold. I think they're one of the more fascinating teams because a lot of people are pointing at them to win the ACC, but the gap between them and Clemson and Miami is not quite as big as some people might think it might be. But let's move on to Georgia. When you wear Georgia, when you wear the block G, when you wear red and black at this point, there's pressure. There's no two ways about that. When you are the best program in the country, there's always going to be pressure on you to perform. That's just the way it is. Kirby Smart is no stranger to this pressure because when he came off a national title, they decided to follow it up with another national title. So I don't necessarily think this is going to be too big of a problem for them to deal with. But there's a ton of pressure on this team. They are set up to do remarkable things this year, probably have the best offense they've had in quite some time, especially with all the weapons they have all over the place. So they're expected to be in the national title at the very least. They're expected to, win the SEC and be in the playoff and dominate a lot of the teams on their schedule. So when you're a Georgia player, pressure just comes with it. That's just kind of the way of things around Athens right now. And then I have Penn State. Penn State is someone that is ready to step into the spotlight. With a 12-team playoff, they are in the playoff pretty much every single year that James Franklin has been the head coach. But there wasn't a 12-team playoff before. Now there is, and now you got to deliver. So Penn State has really, you could make the argument they should be higher on this list because Penn State fans have been waiting way too long for this team to really enter the national conversation, really compete for a national title, and this is the year where it feels like they'll at least get into that conversation. Now, can they kick the door down and really get into that big-time conversation of possibly winning a national title? I don't know, but James Franklin has a ton of pressure around him, and it's only increasing. Drew Aller is someone that is probably under as much pressure as anyone around his age probably would be at this point, but when you go to Penn State and you have to compete with Michigan and Ohio State, that's the way of things. So it'll be fascinating to watch them. Ole Miss is another team that I'm watching very closely. This is kind of like another team that we'll get into here shortly where you bring in a lot of transfers. You have a ton of talent that you didn't have a year ago, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Did a remarkable job addressing a lot of the issues that they've had. But it doesn't mean that all of these guys are going to fit together. We talked about it with Texas. In the SEC, you need 11 guys to fit together. You can't just have a couple making big-time plays and then hope everything falls into place. That's what Ole Miss had a year ago, and it did not work out at all. So I definitely think they've done a great job of addressing all those issues, but it's a different thing from having those players on the roster to making those players do the things that they need to do for you to win an SEC title. And when you talk about Jackson Dart coming back, you talk about Lane Kiffin having all this energy around him at Ole Miss. This feels like the time to strike. This feels like the moment where they can change the narrative around Ole Miss, around Lane Kiffin, around everything around that program, and definitely turn college football on its head. Now, will they do it? That's a big-time question mark because it's a level of pressure that they have not had to deal with around Ole Miss in quite some time. So it'll be fascinating to watch that. Then we get into the top five, and we got Oregon to start this off. I think Oregon has a ton of pressure. Dan Lanning going into his third year did a great job in his first 2 years. There's no two ways about that. Created an incredible team, but you missed the mark by just a little bit those 2 years, and I think people are very, very upset about that around Oregon, especially losing to the team that you lost to in Washington is definitely not what they wanted in that last season, and I think going into this season, they're expecting to compete in the Big 12, or Big 10, excuse me. They're expecting to compete there. They're expecting to get to the playoff. They're expecting to do a lot of these big-time things, and they have to make a step forward to do that. Dan Lanning has to, take a step forward with this team. They have personnel-wise. It's definitely a better team from a personnel perspective than it was a year ago, but again, you got to fit all those guys together and make sure it all works. So it'll be fascinating to watch them unfold. Miami is another team that I'm watching super, super closely. They have pushed their chips to the center of the table. That's just the way of things. They have fully committed to 2024 being the season that sets off all other seasons, that lets them back into the party, that gets them back on the national radar, like 2023 was for Texas and kind of for Florida State, although 2022 was kind of that anyway. But I think Miami, the first 2 years for Mario Cristobal have not necessarily gone the way he wanted to. And I think some people underestimated the rebuild that had to happen around there because their roster was in really bad shape if you want to be a national contender when he got there. So I tend to think he's kind of on schedule. Now, the reality is you just made the schedule speed up a little bit with some of the people that you brought in, especially Cam Ward from the transfer portal. So they've got to deliver. They've got to be a team that competes for the ACC, that does a ton of really incredible things. And maybe you kick the door down. Maybe you get to the playoff and become a big-time conversation nationally. But as of right now, it's a little bit of it's a question mark at the best. It's one of those things that you won't believe it till you see it with Miami, kind of. And then you got number 3. I got Texas. I think we can all agree Texas getting back last year to the playoff, getting back in the national conversation is huge. It's huge for that program. It's huge for Steve Sarkisian. But the reality is Texas fans across the country would tell you that that's not what being back is. Being back is not necessarily sticking around for 1 year and then fading back off into oblivion. You got to stick around, and especially going into the SEC, that's going to be a little bit harder. There's some questions about how they'll adapt to the new SEC, how they'll handle the scheduling aspect. You're not just going to have 1 week that's pretty much penciled and win, and then 1 week that is going to be a little bit tougher. Every single week is going to be tough in the SEC, and that's something that Texas is going to have to adapt to, and it's going to be fascinating to watch them. I think Sark and Texas have a chance to totally change the way that people talk about them, especially Sark, because it feels like a lot of people are looking at last season not necessarily as a fluke, but just I think they're looking at it a little bit skeptically, and I think they're kind of waiting for 2024 to confirm one way or another what Texas is, and they definitely want to deliver in 2024, that's for sure. But then let's move on to Clemson. I think we've talked about Clemson a lot. Dabo is steadfast in his beliefs around the transfer portal, around recruiting, around all of the stuff that makes a college football program. He knows the way he wants to do things, and he's not going to let anyone tell him differently. And I kind of respect that about him. I understand it's not necessarily the way I would go about business, but respect that he is standing on his business and kind of going forward the way that he sees fit. But you got to deliver this year. That's just the reality. If he doesn't deliver this year, some conversations will be had around Clemson. Now, Dabo's not in danger by any means. He's won 2 titles. He's dominated the ACC for quite some time, so he's not in danger of losing that job this year, but he is in danger of having to sacrifice some of his principles and having to dip into the transfer portal and having to do some of the things that he does not want to do. So a ton of pressure on him, because if they deliver, then no one will ask questions. If they don't deliver and continue to take that step back that they have the last couple of years, some questions are going to be had and some conversations might be had, and it might end up with Dabo Swinney not necessarily being the head coach of Clemson in 5 years, but as of right now, he's safe. It's just this year is going to be huge for the future of Clemson. And number 1, far and away, it's Ohio State. It's not even close. There is a gap, a gargantuan gap between 1 and 2, because you can't lose to Michigan 3 years in a row. You can't win no Big Ten titles in 3 years. You can't do some of the things that they have done the last 3 years and not have the most pressure in the country. Ohio State is Ohio State. They're going to compete for national titles. They should compete for national titles. The last couple of years, you haven't even really given yourself a shot. Obviously, they had the chance against Georgia. That one didn't go their way, which is yet another bad break for Ryan Day in his career. But the reality is everything's in place. This is the best defense that he has had, Ryan Day, that is, at Ohio State by a wide margin. This is going to be one of the best defenses in the country. The offense is a little bit more worrisome with Will Howard coming in and not really knowing what you have at quarterback, but I think they'll be fine. They have the best running back duo in the country. They have the best wide receiver room in the country. The O-line's going to get a ton better, so I think they'll be okay there. Everything is in place for this team. There is not a thing that is off the table, including winning a national title in truly dominating fashion, rolling through their schedule, doing incredible things, and going down as one of the more dominant programs in the recent history, because this team is just ridiculous. Everything is in place. Everything is all on the table, and Ohio State always has pressure. They're always going to be a team that you expect to see at the top of the mountaintop. You expect to see competing for national titles. But this is different. This is not, we expect you to be there. It's you better be there, or Ryan Day is going to have some very awkward conversations that he has to have. So all of these teams are fascinating to watch. Obviously, there are a ton of different ways you could order these, because a lot of these have different pressures. Maybe some is national title pressures. Maybe some is just compete. But a lot of those teams have just so much going into this year. They've pushed their chips to the center of the table, and some are set up to stick around for quite some time in Georgia and Ohio State. some maybe not so much. And Miami, maybe Ole Miss are really looking at this year as maybe the year for them. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think when you talk about pressure around teams, it starts with Ohio State. That's the team that you're all going to be watching very, very closely this upcoming year. But there's plenty of other teams that have a lot going into this year. So it's going to be fascinating to watch that unfold, but that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for every content and update you could possibly want. We have incredible people covering every sport you could possibly need and possibly want, so come on over to GSMC and we have you fully covered. But that will do it for what ended up being quite a long show, honestly, but I'll get out of the way for my man Kenneth here. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.